Welcome to the Mama Village, Laura.
Thank you for having me.
I'm super excited to have you on here today. Do you want to start by telling the listeners a bit about yourself? So, your age, who is in your family, and where you're from?
Yeah, sure. So, my name is Laura and I'm 28. I live on the Sunshine Coast with my husband Ben and my two kids, my daughter who's 2.5, and my son who's just turned 6 months.
Oh, beautiful. So, today we're going to talk about your conception journey, your pregnancies, and the birth of your beautiful children. Do you want to start by telling us about your conception journey? So, where and when did your conception journey begin, and what did that look like?
Yeah, sure. So, we had a very intentional conception journey. We got married in late 2020 and knew that we really wanted to try and start our family as soon as possible. I was really conscious that my parents are quite a bit older. My mum had me when she was 49. And so I was just, really mindful that I wanted them to be involved in our family's life. And I had always seen and known that they had had a really difficult conception journey themselves. They'd actually had a failed adoption and then a few rounds of IVF and ended up needing to use an egg donor to be able to have me. And my egg donor actually ended up being my mum's niece, so my cousin. So my cousin is technically my biological mum, which is a pretty cool story.
Wow, what a
Yeah.
story!
Yeah, it's a pretty cool bit of lineage into how I'm connected to different women in my family, which I've always grown up knowing that. They've always been very open and telling me. And I've always thought that it was pretty special.
Yeah, wow. And having you at 49 too,
I
that's
know.
incredible,
I
especially
know.
in that day and age.
I know. That's what always I keep coming back to. Like, it was so different back in the 90s. And I just can't believe that they did that. But they did. And it's been really beautiful. But having had all of that in mind, we were really excited to, have our own family ourselves. But really just did not expect to find that part of our journey so emotionally grueling. I want to extend some big love to people who have had long conception journeys, because in the scheme of things, ours really wasn't that long. But I do have to say that just cycle of feeling really excited and hopeful, and then heartbreak, and then trying to get back on the bandwagon all over again was just really incredibly hard and just all consuming. We did actually end up falling pregnant the first month after getting married, but sadly that ended up being an early loss. And then a few months later, again, we fell pregnant, and we were so excited to have our little rainbow baby, and it just felt also right. But that pregnancy ended up being an ectopic pregnancy. And that was just a whole other layer of grief and loss. I took a pregnancy test and got a faint positive, but that same day I started bleeding, and I kept testing and the lines kept progressing and getting darker. So whilst I was feeling really anxious, I think there was that layer of my intuition kind of coming to me, and I had this bit of a sense that something wasn't quite right. But I also didn't think that I was really in the headspace at that time to really go with my intuition. So I was trying to make sense of what was happening, and I really held on to the idea of implantation bleeding. And I just thought that it had to be that. And I was really holding on to hope that everything was okay. But I think that was kind of the first sign that perhaps something really wasn't going, how it was supposed to. We went to my GP thinking that we were just going to our general first appointment, and I mentioned the bleeding. And she kind of reassured me, but also suggested that we did some repeat HCGs and an early scan just to rule out anything like an ectopic, but also kind of gave me the impression that she didn't really think it was that. But as it turns out, my HCG was rising, but slowly, which can indicate an ectopic pregnancy. And then when we went to our early scan, it was confirmed that the pregnancy was in my right fallopian tube. And I think when I first found out about that, I was just I just went straight into shock and a bit of disbelief, I think. I don't think I really had the capacity in those moments for a big emotional release. And I think my coping mechanism kicked in straight away. I just think I went into fix it mode, and I just started researching everything and trying desperately to understand what was going to unfold for us. We went to the hospital, and because I wasn't experiencing any of that really severe stabbing pain that you often hear associated with ectopic pregnancy, we opted for expectant management. So basically just to wait and see, because often, well, not often, but sometimes your body can recognize that it's not a viable pregnancy and miscarry on its own. And so we were kind of hoping that that was going to be our path. But as it turned out, after about a week and a half, my HCG kept rising. So we needed to opt for either doing the methotrexate or have surgery. And I don't know, we ended up opting to have the surgery. And it felt like such a huge decision at the time because, and I almost felt myself feeling a little bit silly for opting for something that felt like perhaps there was something less invasive that was also an option, like having the methotrexate. But after hearing taking the methotrexate would mean that you'd need to wait a certain period of time after to try and conceive again, that just felt, that weighed on me so much, and that felt way too big to even consider, because after having gone through so many months already of trying to fall pregnant, I couldn't bear the thought of having to wait longer, and I really needed to lean into having some hope ahead of me. And I think that was what I was holding on to cope in those moments. So that ended up not being an option for us. But I also, like, on reflection, think that there was probably an element of my intuition calling me to the surgery anyway, because as it turns out, when I did have the surgery and I was under, they found that my tube had actually ruptured and I was bleeding internally, which is so wild because I didn't have any of that stabbing pain that would be associated with, like bleeding internally in a ruptured fallopian tube. If anything, I had some mild cramps. But yeah, I'm so grateful that we really listened to that calling, and that was obviously the right decision in those moments. But yeah, certainly something that I grappled with a lot on if that was the right thing. Yeah, and I think like the emotional impact of that loss was just unlike anything that I've ever really experienced. It was the first time in my life that I had really known true grief, and it was just so heavy. And it felt, being an ectopic, I feel like there was that added layer of it being more complicated, because I felt like I had this little soul that was coming to me to heal my heart from my first loss, and they were trying to grow, but just because of how it worked out, we had to intervene for my own safety. And that just brought up a lot of complicated feelings, because I think I found myself like just wishing it could have been a miscarriage, which, yeah, is just really hard to wrap your head around how to make sense of that, because like I knew how clever nature could be in recognizing when you had a non-viable pregnancy. And whilst that's heartbreaking in itself, the ectopic just didn't make sense to me. Like I couldn't understand why and how this was happening. And then of course there was the added layer of, losing a fallopian tube, and then what that meant for future fertility. Like losing a baby that you so deeply yearn for is one thing, but then having some of your fertility affected and just not knowing how that was going to unfold brought so much fear. And I think there was also an element of like grieving some of my innocence and like blissful naivety around falling pregnant in the future. There was a lot of feelings that got brought up around like, if I'm lucky enough to fall pregnant again, am I actually ever going to feel excited and happy about it? Or is all of the fear and anxiety just going to cloud that experience for me? And I feel like that was another layer to the grief that, just felt really, really heavy.
Yeah, like there's this element of not only losing your precious babies, then losing your fallopian tube, but then grieving the excitement of when you do fall pregnant and it's a viable pregnancy. Like there's just so much grief around that.
Yeah, it was really a lot and really, really big. And the other layer of that was that we hadn't told anyone what we were going through at the time. It was something that was really like private and sacred to us, just our whole trying to conceive journey. And we had made the decision early on that we wanted to keep it private. But because of that decision, it did mean that we really had to lean on each other. And like there was an element of loneliness and heaviness that I think, really, really did weigh on us.
Yeah. And so when you found out about the ectopic pregnancy, did you already have an understanding about what an ectopic pregnancy was?
I did, yeah. So I knew of it, but my understanding was that it was really, really rare. And so, of course, that makes you think, oh, that's not going to happen to me. So I think that's where a lot of that like initial shock and disbelief came in, because I just couldn't understand how this was going to be my story.
Mm. And if you had a little bit of an understanding about ectopic pregnancies, did you understand what that meant for you in the sense that the pregnancy wouldn't be viable? Because I have heard stories in the past where it's not properly explained in a way that's respectful and understanding to women about what an ectopic pregnancy means and how it's not viable, basically, no matter what, right? There's no,
Yeah.
yeah. And so, because the language around it is honestly quite poor, I think, from medical professionals to women, even processing that it's actually not viable no matter what, I think women find really difficult. And so I'm wondering what your experience was like hearing that and whether you already knew that that would be the outcome.
Yeah, I think from memory, I immediately was researching on, like, when we did our scan and we found out there was ectopic, and then we're on the drive to the hospital, I immediately was like on my phone trying to figure out and understand what an ectopic pregnancy meant. So I found that out. I'm not sure if I already knew that previously or not, but either way, I found that out, on my own versus having to be told it. So when they did talk about that at the hospital, I did already understand. But I think it wasn't in the moment that I really had this realization, but it was afterwards when I was going through my grief. I agree. They really don't use compassionate terminology when talking about these kinds of issues. It's very detached and, yeah, just, you know, biological, I
Clinical?
guess. And like it takes away, I think maybe the idea is that that's supposed to help you in the moment understand that, it's pregnancy tissue. But of course, to us mothers, it's not. Like in our heart and in our soul, that's our baby. And just having the acknowledgement of someone saying your baby, I think would go a long way. It might be hard to hear in the moment because obviously you are having to make the choice to lose your baby, but for your overall like journey of coming to terms with it, I think it would be really important just to have that acknowledgement and honor that soul that, was living inside you, even though it was such like, short time, doesn't make them any less. And I think that can be really helpful in your grief journey. So yeah.
I'm so glad you spoke about that because you're totally right. It's a baby. It's your baby. You're a mother from the moment that conception happens.
Yeah.
And it's a loss to be grieved and it's a baby to be honored. And I love how you've said that. And I think it's super important for the language around early loss to be changed to acknowledge these sorts of journeys.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think being able to like sit in that feeling and not just think of it as a medical event that happened to you and it was, the loss of your so wanted baby and really loved. And that's a connection that, like you don't get in any other part of your life. Like that's a really, really special thing, even if it is an early loss, because it changes you from that very moment. And yeah, I think it's really important to be able to sit with that in that space. And I think actually being able to feel that to its full capacity and really embrace the grief in the aftermath was really pivotal for me in being able to like come out the other side and get that sense of peace and closure. And whilst I still feel like a sense of sadness over losing that pregnancy and like a deep wish to be able to honor that baby, I now feel like I have this deep sense of knowing of why that chapter had to be like that in our story. And I have a clarity over those angel babies that we lost needed to go to the stars to guide our babies down to us. And I don't think if I had have allowed myself to sit in that grief and like really feel it and move through it, I would have been able to come out the other side and have that clarity. Because like I said in the beginning, it couldn't make sense of it. It didn't make sense to me. So yeah, now it's still a sad thing, but also it brings like peace and closure.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. It's like, I know that this journey, well, I mean, I can't even imagine what this journey might have been like for you, but the fact that you've described it in such a way and said that it's guiding you with your now babies, I just think that's such a beautiful message
Yeah.
and so incredibly brave as well. And do you want to talk a little bit about what are some of the specific coping mechanisms that you used and how you moved through that grief after the pregnancy? What was that process like for you?
Yeah, well, like I said, I think because it was just my husband and I really holding each other through that space, I think we just really, had to be conscious of being there for one another in all of that and actually allowing the feelings to come up. And as uncomfortable as that felt and how heartbroken we really felt in the moment, I think it was really important and really pivotal that we did allow it to come up and we didn't try and push it away and we didn't try and figure it out and make sense of it. And because I'm such a fixer, I think that was probably like one of the first times in my life where I have really begun to surrender to what was unfolding. And I think that was probably the main coping mechanism rather than trying to like cope with it by push it away. But also, having said that, parallel to that, there was that part in my mind that was thinking, okay, but we just need to conceive again. And I think a lot of my conscious mind, once we moved through the grief, just went to hyperfixating on conceiving again. And honestly, I think I made it my whole personality on wanting to have a baby in that time of my life. It was, really, really consuming. And it brought about a lot of like joy and beauty in my life. But I have to say that it was all I ever thought about.
Oh, I can't even imagine what that must have been like for you.
Yeah.
And so then, how did this experience as well shape your perspective of pregnancy in the healthcare system after that? Because, like you said before, you really trusted in the body's ability to fall pregnant, but also if there was going to be that early infant loss, that your body processed that in its own time and in its own way. So, how did this experience shape that perspective and did that evolve at all for you?
Yeah, so I think like I had never really felt comfortable in a hospital setting, and I'd always carried a lot of anxiety around that space. And I had a difficult experience in my teenage years with my mental health in the hospital. And so I'd always kind of had a sort of mild distrust and just a bit of like a negative association with being inside a hospital. So the ectopic experience kind of just added to that layer. And I think there was a lot of just negative weight in my nervous system around all of that. And I think that ended up really contributing to how things ended up playing out in both of my births in different ways.
Yeah. Well, let's then talk about your first full term pregnancy. So, can you describe how you felt in that moment when you found out that you were pregnant again?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned before that I was worried about how it was actually going to end up feeling when I found out I was pregnant again. And surprisingly, I did have a really big amount of excitement. There was a layer of anxiety, but for the most part, if I think back, what really comes to mind is just relief and joy and excitement and just a bit of a knowing that things were different this time. And I can't really describe it or articulate it, give it enough justice, but it just felt different. And I had a dream, like in my 2 week wait, that cycle, that I was pregnant and that it was a girl. And then as it turned out, that's exactly what happened. So I definitely felt anxious, but I knew it was different.
Wow. And so then how were you feeling physically and emotionally throughout the pregnancy? So how did you move through that first trimester and then how were you feeling as the pregnancy progressed?
But I think that bit of anxiety kind of started to lessen as the pregnancy progressed, and the excitement and like sense of fulfillment and just purpose just kept growing. And I felt really at peace in my pregnancy. Physically, the first trimester, I was really lucky to not experience really any severe sickness. I definitely had that exhaustion that I think so many of us experience. But by about the 20-week mark, I had a really severe onset of pelvic pain, and that continued out through the rest of my pregnancy, where yeah, my pelvic girdle pain and like SBD was just, yeah, rife. It was really, really hard. And having had that so early on was just not something that I really expected. So I ended up getting into the MGP for that pregnancy at the hospital. And I felt really privileged to have done that. And I was really proud of myself for advocating, getting the referral in early, and, doing all the things that are recommended to us to be able to get into that program. But unfortunately, I had a really bad experience in my first appointment, and I really did not connect with the midwife who was allocated to me, which was so disappointing because I thought like I had done all the right things to get this continuity of care and it's the gold standard and how amazing. But unfortunately, it was an issue around language. She said something that I will never forget how it made me feel. And I guess this is just like so potent to how important the language that we use is and how much it can affect women. But I was explaining to her about when we were completing our paperwork, if I had had previous pregnancies, and my ectopic was obviously recorded on my file, but I was explaining about the early loss before that. And she looked at me and said, would we even really call that a pregnancy? And I still just cannot understand how that is ever okay to say to a mother in front of you. Like, it just doesn't, I don't know, no matter which way I spin it, like, that is messed up.
Literally all the hairs on my body have just stood on end. That is disgusting.
I know. And like, I think I've tried to understand where she was coming from, of like, okay, well, if in medical terms you wouldn't record that on my file as a pregnancy, fine, whatever, I don't care, but you still would never say that to the vulnerable, grieving mother in front of you who's just shared something so sacred and private. Like,
There's no excuse for that.
No,
That's disgusting.
I know. So all of that to say, I was like, well, hell no, am I birthing with you? Clearly that is not a safe space. But yeah, I'm a real people pleaser, yes person, and just I fear confrontation so much. And so my trauma response is always to fawn. And I was like, but I also knew that birth was so important to me that I couldn't let that happen. So I put my big girl pants on and complained and said that I would like to change. And luckily enough, I was able to go with another MGP team, which was actually the birth center at school. It was actually just like such a lucky draw because I didn't know that existed, because I don't think lots of people know that it exists. So I was lucky to be told about that, and yeah, ended up being put with that MGP. And as it turned out, that ended up being such a good fit for me. So again, it felt like the stars aligned a little bit for me there, because I ended up being diagnosed with gestational diabetes.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. When I say diagnosed, I mean I was 0.1 over the cutoff.
Oh.
I'm sure
Do you want to go into the background about this, or should I?
like, I'm sure we all know where this is going. But yeah, I was heartbroken about having this label slapped onto my file, because I knew the policies. I worked as a qualified dietitian, and during my uni, I did a lot of the education with women for gestational diabetes, so I understood what the hospital policies were around GDM. But I also was very informed on the controversy over the diagnosis, and I had a deep knowing that my baby and I were fine. I knew, and the evidence that I had seen backed all of that up, but it was just all about the policy of the label. I even ended up doing the glucose test again because I was so like in denial, being like, I cannot have this label on my file. This is going to change everything for me. And yeah, I was 0.3 over at that test. So yeah, it was just a bit of a shit show, to say the least. But I was supported in, making noise about not agreeing with the diagnosis and potentially declining the recommendations of the policy by my MGP team. But yeah, it brought up a lot for me, and I have just always struggled with wanting to be that good girl, and yeah, not wanting to disrupt or not wanting to be a nuisance. And honestly, I think that whole issue in my pregnancy just really brought that to the forefront and really asked me to make a choice whether or not I was going to keep living my life like that, or whether or not I was going to stand up for my wishes and really listen to my self-trust and my inner knowing and like work up the courage to advocate for myself. But because that was not something that I had ever really done in my life, it was really draining and it brought up so much anxiety. And I honestly just feel like I spent that whole pregnancy from then on, from getting the diagnosis until the end, gearing up for battle and arming myself with all of the things. And it was internalized for me. I think like I wasn't necessarily what was being said to me by my midwife. It was just I knew of what the policy was and how the hospital system approached a diagnosis of gestational diabetes, and I really internalized that for myself and made it mean a lot to me and carried so much anxiety just around feeling like I needed to be prepared at all times to advocate and fight for what I wanted. Yeah, and I suppose I've always been really naturally drawn to birth, and I'm not really sure why I've always been so interested in it, but even as a child, I remember like wanting to understand and watch birth unfold and understand pregnancy. And I had always kind of immersed my husband in all of that as well. And so we had kind of been on the journey together about what we would like our birth to look like and really making sure that we were educated around it. And so I had started listening to women's stories about a year before we had fallen pregnant. And I had heard so much like beauty and magic being told in those stories. And so I don't think I ever really held fear about giving birth myself, but I know that all of my fear was really grounded in experiencing that unnecessary intervention and birth trauma. And so when the GDM diagnosis came, it really brought that up to the surface for me. And I was in a state of fear about that.
I mean, it makes sense, right? Because any sort of diagnosis like that, your risk of intervention after that point increases by quite a lot. I don't have the statistics in front of me right now, but I will say there is an amazing episode done on the Great Birth Rebellion podcast that really breaks down gestational diabetes diagnosis and what that could mean for you, and also the thresholds, because every single state has a different policy. There's no universal agreement on what classifies a woman as having a gestational diabetes diagnosis, I suppose. So I can link all that information for the listeners in the show notes. But yeah, your fear is valid, even if it wasn't necessarily the midwife's language at that point creating that fear for you. And like you said, you were internalizing it a bit. It's so valid because it just opens up that portal for intervention.
Yep, exactly.
Just by having that diagnosis.
Exactly. And the other, the Great Birth Rebellion episode is absolutely amazing. And the other one that I really found a lot of like peace and solace in was the Midwife's Cauldron and all of Dr. Rachel Reed's work, especially her website, like her blog post around the label of gestational diabetes and the risk, in inverted commas, of big babies. I think her work in sharing all of that, brought a lot of peace to me in I was doing the right thing. And whenever that, good girl mentality popped up of not wanting to be confrontational, I just went back on, no, I do actually know what I'm talking about. And the evidence does say this, and your policy is not aligned with what the evidence says. So if I ever doubted myself, I could always go back on that knowledge. And I couldn't recommend all of that stuff enough, and really, knowing and understanding that.
So coming back to that as well, did that affect your birth plan, I suppose, through the birth centre? Like, had they started talking about what your birth might look like from that point forward?
Yeah, so they spoke to me and shared the policy of recommending having additional growth scans, and then based on the results of those, potentially having an induction at 38 weeks. So I declined doing the growth scans because I was of the mentality that what would my decision be based on the results if I did get told that perhaps my baby was measuring big, which, side note, we all know about the leniency in scans and accuracy of whether or not they're actually correct or not.
So, and I can link again all of that in the show notes too. And also I think once you reach, it's somewhere in the 30-week mark, the scan is actually pretty much totally inaccurate.
Yeah.
There is no possible way to guess how big the baby is
until you weigh
accurately. Yes. Exactly. From 30 weeks pregnancy, and I can link that information in the show notes as well. So it's it doesn't tell us anything.
So I knew that, and so I opted to decline for them because I was like, well, even if I found out that baby was measuring big, I would treat that with a grain of salt. I would know that that's not necessarily accurate, and even if I had a big baby, I could birth a big baby. So I was like, I'm not going to change what I'm going to do based on the results of those scans, so I'm not going to give you the armor to fearmonger me into having an intervention that I don't feel like I need. So I declined those and then declined having an induction. I actually declined with my midwives even talking about it, when they were really respectful of that, and really supported my decision in doing that. So that was really good.
So then what was your perception of birth at this time? Because it sounds like you had a deep trust in your body and in your baby. And so was your plan to have a physiological labor and birth?
Yeah, it was. Yeah. So prior to falling pregnant and in the early stages of my pregnancy, I had really come to understand physiological birth, and that sounded like it really aligned for me and what I wanted my experience to look like. So basically throughout my pregnancy, that's what I had planned that I wanted to do. And I think I had then spent the rest of my pregnancy really delving deep, doing deep dives into birth and, backing up why I was making the decisions that I was making. In hindsight, I actually, it's such a catch-22 because I really think that knowledge is power, and I'm so grateful that I had all of that knowledge on physiological birth. But I also think that a lot of the research that I was doing and that I was being pulled towards was not necessarily about how to have a physiological birth. It was how to navigate the maternity system. And I think engaging with all of that, whilst I was pregnant, I was really forced kind of out of my body and out of my intuition. And I know that that really didn't give me the presence of mind to feel like I could really connect with my baby and my body as nature really intended me to do. And it's complicated because I think, I'm so grateful to know what I know, but I also can see, and I'm sure it will come up in my story, about how there was so much doing, so much being pulled into my prefrontal cortex and no space to surrender. And I think that might have slightly had a little bit of a disservice to me. So I feel like it's such a balance to get right, because you do need to know these things. And especially if you've made the decision to birth in the hospital system, you do need to know. But it's just a shame that we are in a situation where we're forced to do that, when I think pregnancy is really a time to, and foreshadowing a little bit, but it's a time that where we're called to softness and called to embracing that vulnerability and being with our body and just being, rather than constantly doing all of the things. And I don't think that in navigating all of that anxiety and advocacy for myself allowed me to embrace the softness. I really hardened myself, to be honest, and just spent so much time outward rather than being drawn inward. And I think that really unfolds in my birth, to be honest, too.
I just feel like from the moment we find out that we're pregnant, we are just fighting a battle, a constant uphill battle right until the birth. Actually, even after the birth, postpartum, it's still an uphill battle. There is no aspect of the medical system right now that supports a mother having the innate trust in her own ability to birth their child or to be a mother. There's no room for the medical system to just trust in women to be able to do this. There's zero trust.
And it's really hard because, I consider my first birth really positive, but when you understand that, you can't unsee it. When you can't unsee how it is set up from the very beginning to not support you. And the only way that you can really have a positive experience, or I shouldn't say a positive experience, because lots of women can have a positive experience even if they experience the interventions, if they felt like they made those decisions themselves. But just from my story, I couldn't have had the experience that I had unless I went in with my armor on. And I think that really hijacked my pregnancy. And I feel like I birthed my daughter not knowing the connection that nature intends you to know with your baby, because I didn't have the space in my brain to be able to do that because I was so focused on just getting it right, and that was part of my good girl stuff as well. Like, I had decided that I wanted to do this and I was going to be a damn good birther, and I knew, and I delved into all the things I had to do to get that right. And I was so proud of myself for doing that. And I still am really proud of myself, but I just know that that's not how it's supposed to be. And I know that we as women deserve so much more from our birthing journeys, and there's so much more to it. It's not just about having a positive experience. It's really about how it makes you feel and that transformation. And yeah.
Totally. Well, let's get into your birth story. So how were you feeling towards the end of your pregnancy, and then how many weeks were you when labor started?
Yeah, so I think I mentioned before that I was really sore with pelvic pain, and that was, really big for me at the end. And that, along with the anxiety of navigating the hospital policy for induction with the GDM stuff, it was a looming sense of panic for me. So I was just in a bit of a state of constant anxiety and fear towards the end of my pregnancy. I obviously got over the time period of an induction because of the GDM. I declined all of that, and that was actually peaceful and fine. We got past that. But then I got to my 40-week date and I started to feel a sense of urgency and a bit of responsibility to get things going, in inverted commas, just to try and attempt to avoid the conversations. That's what I really feared the most, is I feared having those fear-mongering conversations, knowing that that was a possibility of what would be to come. I felt a responsibility that I needed to do something to try and get labor going. And on reflection, I can so see how that ironically had pretty much the opposite effect. There was no oxytocin flowing in that stage at all. There were a few other things at play in our life at the time. So we were building a house and we were due to get our keys handed over on the date that I was 42 weeks. So we were like, are we going to be moving house before having a baby, after a baby? Where are we at? We were in a very much a limbo. COVID restrictions also were huge at that time because it was February 2022. So the borders had just opened and COVID was everywhere. So there was lots of restrictions going on. That was all on our minds. And my husband had also unexpectedly not had his contract renewed at work because he had taken early paternity leave. And they obviously didn't like that. So, he's an emergency nurse at the hospital. And unfortunately, I was 39 weeks pregnant when we found that out, because we had made the decision to isolate ourselves in the later part of my pregnancy, trying to keep him safe to be able to come with me to the hospital to birth. Having him work in emergency was obviously carried a lot of fear for us. Anyway, so that was obviously huge and just so much stress all unfolding in those last few weeks of my pregnancy. Eventually, I did go into spontaneous labor at 42 and 1, and I had a really, really long labor. And the early stages, I just basically it started with light cramping. I woke up on the morning of 42 and 1 and I had very mild cramps and was like, oh, thank goodness it's finally happening. I was conscious that I really wanted to rest, but I also had that thing looming in the back of my mind where I had a responsibility to speed things up and make sure that labor progressed, all with the intention of avoiding intervention. And I ended up having a full day of contractions and just, a really blissful early labor, doing all of the things. But I was sure that night we would be heading into active labor and going into the hospital. And I think I just spent so much of that day and night in my conscious mind willing to get things going faster and, just trying to do all of the things. I was so big about active birth skills, and it comes to mind just that I really felt I had to do it myself, and I really had to do labor rather than let labor happen. And so I think on reflection, that really pulled me into that prefrontal cortex, and my limbic brain could not take over. So I had that internalized pressure of just wanting to try and navigate avoiding the hospital policies. So I know that also being a first-time mum could have had something to do with the fact that it was a long labor, and I was prepared for that. But when I think about it now, I can really see how that doing brain probably took over and had a lot to do with that. I ended up laboring at home for about 30 hours, and then I had a crisis of confidence at that point, and so we headed into hospital. Unfortunately, my midwife, and all of her backups had COVID. So all 5 of my team that I had known weren't available, and I ended up having to just have the midwives that were on birth suites that day. So I was also conscious, because we found this out about 3 or 4 days before I went into labor. I was conscious that we were going to be met with unfamiliar faces, and I was worried about knowing that sometimes when you make the move to the hospital, you can have a lull in your labor, and that I was kind of expecting that. But I also knew being met with unfamiliar faces and not knowing who I was could, really complicate things. Plus, I also think I had this thing in my mind of like, oh, I'm the difficult patient. I'm the one who's, like over 42 weeks with a GDM diagnosis. I've been the one who's declining all of the things. And I just was really uncomfortable with being that person, because in the rest of my life, I had never been the difficult person. And so
It's amazing how advocating for your rights makes you a difficult person.
Right. I know.
Like,
that good girl conditioning goes so freaking deep, doesn't it? Yeah. As it turns out, the midwives who were there were really respectful. Immediately, they read my birth preferences. They basically just left us to it. And I declined the CTG monitoring that was recommended just for being over 42 weeks. And they were completely respectful of that. I consented to having intermittent Doppler checks. I didn't want a cannula. And yeah, it was all fine. They were very respectful of the environment. They pretty much gave us the space to just continue labouring how we were, and we're quite in tune with knowing when to pop over and offer an encouraging word and when to just step back and give us space. So that was actually a really positive thing. I ended up hopping in the shower for quite a few hours at the hospital, and then I was at this point really still leaning on all of my active positions that I was telling myself I really had to do, and like I needed to try this one and try this one because that's what all of the books said. And I was using my breath, and I think at that point is when I really started to use sound a lot, just knowing that I wanted to really extend my exhales and try and make low downward sounds to allow my body to soften, and try really consciously to not lean up and out of the pain, trying to like sink down into it and let it flow. But after a while, I feel like the intensity was growing when I first arrived at the hospital, and then after a while that lull did come. And I think my midwife really gently asked me how did I feel like things were going, and when I realized that I could reply and I was in that little bit more of a conscious mind, I noticed that things probably had slowed down a little bit. And at that point she asked if I would like a vaginal examination, and perhaps if we could rupture my waters whilst I was there. And that was something that I hadn't want any augmentation of my labor, but in that vulnerable moment, after it being like, I don't know, 35 hours or something of laboring, I was like, yes, please just break them. I was so exhausted, and I try really hard to not beat myself up about that decision, because in the moment it did feel really like the right thing to do. But now, knowing what I know now, I probably wouldn't have done that. But that's a side note. After my waters were broken, the intensity definitely really heightened, and I think I entered transition pretty shortly after that, and there was no position that I felt allowed the contractions to flow at that point. I started vomiting, and I was really struggling to keep my voice down and low, and the pressure in my pelvis, oh my gosh, that was something that I will never forget. That sensation of, your hips widening and baby entering the birth canal is just an intensity that really can't be put into words, I think. I was not expecting it at all, because I thought the intensity of contractions was, hard enough. But yeah, so I really struggled with that phase of labor, as I'm sure lots of women can resonate with. But yeah, at that point is when I decided that I wanted to hop into the bath. I just remember when I hopped into the bath, how hot it was. It was so, so hot, which obviously it has to be a temperature for their policy for baby to be born into. But I was just, really struggling with the temperature. And whilst I got a slight release in pressure, which is what I was craving and why I wanted to hop into the bath, the feeling that just overtook me was just, I was way too hot. But I was also in that stage where there was no moving me. That's where I was stuck. So after about only a few minutes of being in the bath, I feel like the pressure was really calling me to start pushing. And I also must say that I really did not enjoy that sensation. That was so physically draining after such a long labor. I was so exhausted, and I was not expecting to struggle. Maybe struggle is not the right word for pushing, but it was just the hardest thing I have ever done. And I think,
do you mean the intensity of it?
I think it was just really hard work. Like it was just really, really hard. And I know you can of course it is, you're pushing a baby out, but I had heard so much about the fetal ejection reflex, and I kind of thought that that was the norm, that like everyone experienced that when you had a physiological labor, but I definitely did not. I had the urge to push and I felt the need to bear down, but it was just really hard work.
So what you're saying is you didn't experience the fetal ejection
Yeah,
reflex?
no, not at all.
Okay,
Not,
interesting.
not,
Yeah.
not at all. I wonder perhaps if I had breathed through those first bearing down feelings rather than gone straight to pushing, perhaps maybe. I mean, yeah, I'll never know. But yeah, after about 40 minutes it ended up being of pushing, my daughter's head was born. And I think that's the part that really sticks out to me most to this day, is just that lull between the contraction of her head being born and her body, where I can vividly still feel when her shoulders were rotating inside of me, and just like being so like awestruck by that feeling. And yeah, I hadn't heard anyone ever talk about what that would feel like. And so I was so surprised. And I had my birth filmed actually. So you can hear in my birth film from my photographer being like, oh, she's moving. And like just everyone like having a little giggle in the room. It was really special. Yeah. And then so slowly her body followed in the next contraction and she came out into the water. I actually put my hands down in between my legs to grab her as I felt the sensation of her coming out. But unfortunately, the midwives actually grabbed my hands and pulled my hands back to stop me from like touching her, because they have the policy not to touch baby when they're underwater to avoid stimulating them to take a breath, and like only to touch after they've fully come out. And it was just such a shame, because that was something that I was really important to me. And I also had that instinct, like it was my instinct of to come down and grab my baby, because I could feel when she was leaving my body. Yeah, it's something that's a bit disappointing. Yeah, I must say I was a bit heartbroken by that.
It's an instinctual thing for the mother to do. Totally. Midwives, I get that. Don't touch baby until they're fully out because of the risk of them swallowing water. But the own mother in that moment where she's trusting her instincts, I don't understand that.
Yeah, 1000%. Yeah. And that's what I really made sense of after the fact, once I, kind of, researched that a little bit, being like, I don't understand why they stopped me from grabbing my baby. But yeah, I get totally that's their policy, that they're not supposed to touch. But yeah, like when that's nature receiving your baby for safety reasons. Like you feel them exit your body and you reach down to grab them to stop them from falling or whatever. Luckily we were in the bath, so it was fine. But it actually did make for some really incredible footage. My birth photographer had a GoPro in the water, and you can kind of see as she comes out, she like swims off to the side, and it's really, really cute how she like swims off to the side, and then my hands come down and I couldn't quite reach her because my hands had been pulled back. So the midwife ended up grabbing her, guiding her to my hands, and then I got to pull her up onto my chest. And she immediately gave a little cry, and I was so happy to see her, and it was like just an overwhelming sense of relief. Like I was happy to see her, but I definitely didn't have that instantaneous like love rush. It was definitely far more of like a slow burn in my connection with her, because I think there was a lot of that exhaustion being clouded. It had ended up being 40 hours in total from when I had my first contraction. I obviously hadn't slept in that time too. So, and I had been so bloody active, like just nonstop doing all of the things. So yeah, I was definitely exhausted at that point. So yeah, I was really happy to see her, but just relieved that it was over.
Yeah. And look, there's even all those sort of little interruptions along the way too, to your oxytocin just naturally flowing through your body, like the midwife pulling your hands away, being in the hospital, the heat of the bath and not being able to relieve that. There's so many like just little interruptions as well that it could have contributed. I mean, we'll never know, but
No,
it just makes sense.
Yeah, I think I was reflecting with my husband yesterday, just saying like, I can see on reflection now all of those little moments of things that didn't have to happen. I really don't think that nature intended me to have a 40-hour labor. Like that's not how it was supposed to unfold. And there was just little moments, even internalized from me, and things that I was like believing and thinking, as well as the environment and the environment changes, and just all of those things that really disrupted the hormonal flow for sure.
Yeah.
But I still did it. And so I was very proud.
Yeah, so you should be. And so how did the birth of your placenta eventuate after that?
Yeah, so it was only a couple of minutes before I was encouraged to hop out of the bath, which I think reflecting back, it felt like such a big ask for me to like right immediately after such a long labor and then birthing minutes before to stand up, get out of bed, carrying my baby. They put the bed right up next to the bath, but still, even just to get up and out, yeah, it felt like a really big ask. And so I did that, not knowing that I had another option, unfortunately, but I held her to my chest, and it was really important to me to be able to give her the space to do the breast crawl. And that was something that, yeah, it was really important to me doing. So I set her up to be able to do that, and she started doing the breast crawl. And after about 20 minutes of us just like taking her in and letting her move around and bob up and down and like marveling at that happening, the midwife sort of announced that maybe we should get baby to dad for skin to skin so that we could help the placenta come, because I had said in my preferences that I wanted a physiological third stage. But my daughter hadn't latched yet, and I really did not want to interrupt her having the breast crawl and pass her over yet. But in my sort of people-pleasing self, I thought I didn't really have another option, because it was being presented to me as like, we need to give baby over to dad. It's time for the placenta to come now. And because I didn't want to get up and like try a different position to help gravity help the placenta come if it was ready, I just said, oh, well, maybe I should just have the injection then, because I don't want to move. And it pains me so much till this day that no one said anything knowing that that's not what I wanted. They just accepted and were like, okay, yep, that's what we'll do now. And instead of supporting me physically, like I've done so much thinking about how things could have been different around this. I could have been physically supported to get up while still holding my baby to my skin, or I could have been like given other options and like explained other things that we could do. It didn't have to be like that.
And it didn't have to be so rushed.
No, it was 20 minutes.
If you weren't
minutes.
having a hemorrhage, it didn't need to be so rushed. And to give you some credit too, and just for the listeners out there, because I'm sure you're already aware, but the hormones that are flowing through your body right after you give birth are conducive to people-pleasing hormones. So it is really, really difficult to go against that in that sort of moment.
Yeah. And I was also of the mentality of like, oh, well, I've done the birth now. I got the physiological birth of my baby. That's good enough, isn't it? Like, I'll just settle for that. You know, I was of that mentality rather than really envisioning birth of the placenta as sacred as the birth of the baby, which I now truly believe. But they were separate to me in that time. And I was like, oh, well, you don't want to ask for too much, you know, like this is good enough. Anyway, as that unfolded, and what I now know is that having the Syntocin injection, I ended up having a postpartum hemorrhage. And I know now that there's research to suggest that active management in physiological low risk births can cause a hemorrhage. And I will never know, but I really feel that that's exactly what unfolded for me. So,
and was that risk explained to you at the time that they gave you the injection?
No risk at all. Just, oh, yep, cool, perfect. And yeah, so that's what I mean is like, I now know that I could have been supported in that moment so differently. And to the fact that my intuition actually even came out knowing that that wasn't the right decision. But again, I didn't have the tools to really listen to it in the moment, because I voiced to both my photographer and my husband, is this a really silly idea, when I consented to it? And no one said, I don't actually even remember what people's reply was, but I ended up doing it anyway. So no one said, oh, hang on, you don't sound sure there. Maybe we shouldn't go ahead and do this. And like, yeah, I wish that had have unfolded so differently now. But yeah.
Oh, that must be really heavy for you.
Yeah, it was. And I think it's only really now, after having had my second birth, that I've really unpacked a lot of that, because I think for so long I was just like, oh, but you had your birth, like you had the birth that you wanted. You can't ask for too much. We can't have everything, you know, that type of mentality, to really like almost pacify myself. And
it just invalidates anything that you could possibly be feeling.
Yeah. And yeah, I know that I've kind of said to myself a few times, like, I wish I had have known. I wish I had have done more research. I was so informed about birth of the baby, but I really just didn't pay enough attention to the birth about the placenta and what the evidence said, and what impact interventions could have on that phase of birth. But I also want to give myself some compassion around that too, because it wasn't my job in that moment. I also should have been cared for in that moment. And yeah, that was a disservice to me, not from myself, but also from my care provider in that moment.
Oh, totally. There is not one aspect of your story that makes you think you should have responsibility for any of this.
Yeah.
Like the self-compassion that you should have towards yourself and your experience, I hope is strong for you now.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of work that I have been doing, and I do feel that a lot more. But yeah, I just have a bit of sadness for how those immediate moments postpartum then unfolded, because obviously I had this magical water birth at 42 and 3 weeks in the hospital system after a GDM diagnosis. Like, if I had have written all of the things down on a piece of paper, like tick, 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 amazing, you did so good. But when I look back at how it made me feel immediately postpartum, it's all just clouded by, like, those first moments with my daughter are clouded by the management of the hemorrhage that ended up unfolding because of that decision. So, like, then having to have someone place a cannula in my arm, someone doing the most aggressive fundal massage ever. It is not a massage, it is horrific compressions on your uterus, while someone is also manually pulling out clots. You know, like, we've gone from this beautiful, peaceful water birth that's was virtually hands off to that. And I hadn't had any gas or anything through the labor, but when that was happening, oh my gosh, I needed the gas. I remember clinging onto my daughter for dear life, thinking, am I going to drop her? Like, my body is just being pulled in all of these ways. My legs are in stirrups now. You know, I'm bleeding. Like, that has a level of stress too. And there's, like, I don't know, 6 people in the room, whereas there was only 2 before. And yeah, so it was all just clouded by that, unfortunately.
Oh, I'm so sorry that that was your experience. I
Yeah.
am so sorry. And then how was your overall postpartum experience?
Yeah, so I think I was exhausted, and because of the blood loss, I physically did not feel great. I had a couple of small tears, so I just had a couple of grazes, one on my perineum and one on my labia, which I did end up getting stitched, which in hindsight, I don't think I would do that again now, because the recovery of those was actually really quite painful. And whilst they were only first degree tears, yeah, it did actually really hurt. And I think I sort of, yeah, maybe pacified myself about that too, because I was like, oh, well done, you only got a couple of first degree tears. That must be as good as it can get. Like, this pain that you're feeling is just how it is, kind of thing. Again, foreshadowing. That is not as good as it can get at all. But yeah, I think that did make me struggle a little bit in those early days postpartum. The other added element of that was we ended up moving house when I was 2 days postpartum. So I was a bit of a shell in that whole phase, just being in between, not having our space really set up. And, you know, like, I was conscious that I did want to honor that rest time for myself, but life was just not conducive to that at that stage. And I had thought that I was being slow and soaking up that time and really connecting with my baby. And perhaps I kind of was, but I certainly don't reflect on that time in the same way that I do my second birth and postpartum. So I think it was all just a bit tricky with how life was at that moment. We did have lots of help, obviously, in moving. I certainly did not do anything. I sat in a chair on the corner with baby skin to skin and breastfed, and that was amazing. But yeah, it was just that element of stress of all moving parts happening behind me. I had filled my freezer with lots of postpartum meals, and so we were set up like that. But yeah, there was just an aura of a bit of, like, a stressful period, I think, that kind of clouded
Yeah.
postpartum.
I mean, they say, I think one of the most stressful periods of your life is moving house. So adding on a baby to that, you can imagine what sort of environment that's going to create. But well done you for getting through it.
Thank you.
Like, and you've still got this beautifully positive mindset. And I totally love that. I'm in awe of you. I
No, thank
really,
you.
really am.
Thank you.
So
I was really proud of myself. I was, yeah.
good, good. So then when it came time to thinking about conceiving again, did you do anything differently to prepare to conceive?
Yeah, so we had always known and hoped that we wanted to have our babies close together. My husband is a twin, so he grew up with a very close brother, and I'm an only child, but I had grown up next door to 2 girls who were 14 months apart, and we grew up there. Like, we were there in the same house for like 20 years together. So I kind of, like, joked that I had sisters when I wanted them, and then we just, like, went home when we needed a break. So I had seen their relationship be really close, being 14 months apart. And then my husband's twin brother had all of his kids really close together as well. So I was just surrounded by all of these people who had really close siblings, and I really envisioned that for myself. But I actually, after we had our daughter, at least for the first 6 months, I was really worried that I would never be ready to birth again. Like, after having had that experience, I was really proud of myself because on paper I did it, but I felt like it was too intense to ever want to do that again. And that was, yeah, like a really confusing thing, because I had been like, oh, I'm going to want to get pregnant straight away, basically, but I didn't. And I was like, oh my gosh, am I ever going to feel ready again? Eventually, like, time passed and I did. And I've always been such a birth nerd too, so I was always really immersed in the birth space, and I never stepped out of that even after having my baby. So I was always still surrounded by all of the birth things. And eventually I started to, feel that pull again. And I was like, okay, cool. But that ended up being complicated because or maybe complicated is not the right word, but I was breastfeeding, and so I didn't have a cycle back. And being a type A personality, not having control over that was really, really hard. Again, I struggled emotionally so much, to the point where I almost had like a sense of anger and like almost feeling like my body was broken in a way for not having a cycle, because I had heard stories about other women and people in my circles who had young babies, were breastfeeding, and had their period back and had even conceived. And I was just like, why not me? I want to so badly, but my body is not doing it. Like, why is it not doing that? And it's really, I want to give myself a lot of grace and compassion around this in the past, but I know in those moments I was so angry at my body. And like, it's really hard because it was doing such a beautiful thing, nourishing my daughter. And I loved my breastfeeding journey with her so much. And I was so grateful to my body for doing that, and so grateful for like holding my pregnancy and my birth and all of that. But it's like, okay, but now it's not doing what I want it to do, and what the heck? And it was just really complicated. So that was a really tough emotional time. But I did then get my period back actually at my daughter's first birthday party, which felt quite symbolic within itself. And we ended up conceiving that first cycle, but again, that ended up ending in a loss. So that was another grief journey that was really different, because being a parent and having grief weigh on you so heavily is a very, very different experience. And it was really, really tough.
I'm so sorry.
Thank you. Again, I think that like whole journey comes back in the same sense of my ectopic pregnancy and first loss, that it makes sense to me now. So I have a lot of peace around it. But at the time, you can't make sense of it. And when your attention is being pulled towards your daughter, and it's complicated because you feel like you need to be grateful for the baby that you do have, but you so desperately want that baby, and it just, you can't understand. But I did end up falling pregnant the next cycle again afterwards. So that ended up being on my husband's 30th birthday, as it turns out. So that again feels more made to be and even more symbolic. So that, I think, adds to, that's why it turned out the way that it has to. And so that was the pregnancy with my son.
And so how did your perception of birth evolve? Like, what model of care did you choose this time around?
So this time around, I ended up going with a private midwife to have a home birth. And it was around that kind of like 6-month mark with my daughter that when I decided that I felt ready again to birth again, I just decided I'm going to have a home birth. And I think there wasn't a particular thing that really made me decide that, other than I just had been surrounded by all of the birth things for so long, and I had a really deep understanding of the safety, the evidence around home birth. And I think I had just seen so many magical stories, and like I was so present in all of the birth films being shared on social media and stuff, and I just wanted that for myself. So it felt kind of like a really natural flow into going down that pathway. And I think there was also an element of, I knew if I ever had any worry pop into my head, immediately I could rationalize it with, I've done it before. And whilst I so don't think you need to have a hospital birth first time around, just in my experience, whenever those thoughts came up, I had the evidence that like, I know I am so capable. And after I had done all the unpacking about my first birth, I know that there were so many things that were not conducive to having a physiological birth, and I still did. So I know that when I was in an even more safe environment for me, I could absolutely do it, you know?
Yeah, totally. So was there any fear? I mean, you talked about your fear a bit, but was there any fear with your husband as well? Because you mentioned he was an emergency care nurse, and so he
Yeah.
would see worst case scenario a lot, I imagine, in his profession. So was there any fear for him that he had to process?
Yeah, so my husband's definitely quite medically minded, and I suppose when you think of home birth, you can often think of it as being quite alternative. But actually, when you look at the evidence, it's really not. It's really, really evidence based. And so it makes complete sense. And I think as long as you're open to receiving what the research actually says, and then you add the added layer of like culturally how birth is set up, it all steers you down that path, doesn't it, of like the safest place for so many of us is to home birth. And in our specific circumstances, it made sense. And so he was really supportive, and like I asked him yesterday about how he felt when I first said and made the actual decision that I wanted to home birth for the next time, because like I said, he had been immersed in all of the birth space for years and years now. So he was very much attuned to how I felt, and I had made noise about potentially wanting to home birth. But when I finally made the decision, he said to me, which I thought was just so indicative of his personality, he was just very clear in being like, well, I trusted you and I trusted birth. So yeah, of course. And I love that so much, because to me, it's so much deeper. Like there's just so much to it. But to him, it's just that simple. And I really love that.
I love that as well. That's how it should be.
Yeah.
So, how are you feeling throughout that pregnancy? And let's go straight into your birth story. How many weeks were you when labor started?
Yeah, so again, that pregnancy was really clouded by the pelvic pain. It was actually worse this time round, and having the added element of a toddler to care for. And obviously she was quite young because my kids are 22 months apart. So it was really tough, and I was certainly physically feeling it towards the end of my pregnancy. I mentally was so prepared, actually, even to the fact that I was really expecting to gestate for a long period of time. I was fully expecting to go to 42 weeks, but physically my body was really, really struggling. But I was kind of okay. Like I was mentally okay with just, gritting it and bearing it and getting to the end.
And just before you go on to, did you do anything to try and help with that pain? Like, did you see a physio or acupuncturist or anything like that?
It didn't. And in hindsight, I really wish that I did give myself a little bit more love around that, because I think I really deserved that, but I honestly just gritted and bared it. I was doing yoga through my whole pregnancy and trying to honor myself in those little ways, but I look back now and I really don't know how I coped. Like it was horrific, the level of pain that I was in, and I don't think I should have settled at all. But that when you're a mum to a toddler, your focus is just being pulled in so many other places, and I don't think I honoured myself in the way that I probably really should have. So it's on my mind for future, for sure.
But give yourself some grace and again compassion as well.
Yeah.
So talk about, again, bring us back to how you were feeling towards the end of the pregnancy.
Yeah, so mentally I was in a really good headspace about waiting for labour to come. And time of the year it was just after Christmas time when I was about 39 weeks. And we had quite a few days of it just being really, really tough with the pelvic pain and managing. I noticed that my daughter had become I should also mention that I was breastfeeding through my whole pregnancy, and something that was a really tricky part of navigating that was I got really bad aversion to feeding her. And I had kind of heard noise about women experiencing that, but again, didn't expect to feel it myself. And I really, really struggled with that. That was so hard because I had this vision of tandem feeding my babies, having them close together. It was something that I really wanted to do. And I also found it was really important to me to let my daughter guide our breastfeeding journey and not wanting to wean her unless she felt she was ready. And so I was, holding that with a lot of importance in my heart. But then I started experiencing the aversion, and it was so hard. I think in hindsight, perhaps I would have liked to have gone with that signal that maybe my body was telling me that it was time for me to finish up, but I did. I grit my teeth in bed through that as well. And it has taken a lot of unpacking to be okay with how that ended up unfolding. I am still feeding both of them now, which I'm so proud of doing, but I also know that a lot of that was at my own expense. And yeah, I think maybe I would like to have not ignored my intuition in those moments where it did feel really hard, because I totally recognize how breastfeeding is a relationship between both of us, and it's got to work for both of us for it to continue. And it wasn't working for me in pregnancy. But anyway, here we are. And yeah, I ended up continuing feeding her. So towards the end of the pregnancy, I noticed that she started to get a little bit more cuddly and a little bit more like affectionate in those last few days. And I wrote this note in my phone about like, I feel like she is sensing a shift. She knows that baby is coming soon. And I then heard people talk about how there's a rise in oxytocin right before you go into labor, and your older children can often sense it and they will get more cuddly to you and more loving. And I think that made complete sense to me. But I was also like, oh, probably not. Like, I'm only 39 weeks. Like, I've got 3 more weeks of pregnancy left. It's not going to happen soon. But funnily enough, I think that was probably the first sign that something was coming, as well as the intensity of the pelvic pain changed to, I could feel him so deep in my pelvis. Like, I don't know if you know of the rhombus of Michaelis. I don't know if that's how you say it properly.
No, I don't.
It's if you there's some really amazing photos if you look it up. It's basically there's a triangular piece in your pelvis in your lower back that pops out, and you can visually see from the outside to make space for baby's head to come through the birth canal.
Oh, yes, I do know what you're talking about.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. So like when you're pushing your baby out, oftentimes you can see that triangular bone piece in a woman's pelvis. Mine popped up at like 38 weeks. So he was so low in my pelvis, and my midwife was like, I've never heard of that happening in pregnancy. Like, that happens when baby is eminently coming out in like minutes, not in like weeks beforehand. So I was walking around with him like in my pelvis. Like, it was so painful, but yeah, he was just very ready. So that was very intense, and yeah, another sign that perhaps things would be coming soon. We actually ended up having a really beautiful day 2 days before I went into labor, and it was the first time that we had really like spent quality time together pretty much the whole pregnancy, to be honest, pretty much since he was conceived. So that was quite symbolic in itself. And we had this wonderful day where we swam in the ocean and we really got to connect, and like just the oxytocin vibes were like amazing. The next day, we were going to go to the beach again as a family, but then the weather ended up being really bad. So we're like, oh, what should we do today? Let's just go through our to-do list of all the things we wanted to tick off before we had baby, and we'll just get all of those done. So we did. We had a big day of just ticking off all of the things, doing like big deep clean as all of the nesting vibes came in. And then we sat down that evening and we're just chatting about how crazy it is that we're in this like in-between phase of like our life is about to change so drastically. We can't even like imagine what it's going to be like, but we know we're on the cusp of it. And we were talking about that German word that I think it's a midwife coined as being those last days of pregnancy, and I don't know how to say it. It's like Zeswan or something like that. But if you look it up, you'll see. And it's basically just this term that encompasses the in-between. And it's that phase of where, yeah, everything is about to change and you're in the in-between. And we were talking about how crazy it is that we are in that in-between right now. And like, we don't know. And how beautiful is it that like all of this unknowing is just about to unfold. And it's so exciting, and the anticipation and yeah, all of the things. And then, yeah, as it turns out, that night I went into labor. So I really was in the thick of the in-between in that moment. So my daughter woke up that night at about 2:30 in the morning, and I went in to feed her and settle her. And I had quite a few contractions at that point when I was rocking her back to sleep. And I wasn't really sure if they were going to fizzle out or if they were going to build. So I was kind of just like noticing them, but not really like paying too much attention to them. But I took this photo of me with holding her and rocking her and feeding her to sleep, being like, oh, this might be the last moment of when it's just me and her. Oh, it's going to make me emotional thinking about it. Sorry. Yeah, it was just like such a special moment to like know that that was going to be the last moment of just me and her, and how beautiful it is to have that memory. And I was like, I think in my heart I knew that that was it, but I was still trying to kind of ignore it as much as I could, just to be sure. But I got her back down and I went back to bed. Oh, actually, no, I went to the toilet and I noticed that I lost my mucus plug and had a bloody show. And then I was like, oh, okay, no, we are on, this is it. And it was really funny because I think my daughter actually then woke up again and I was like, oh gosh, okay. So I ran back into her, was putting her back down, and that point my husband woke up and was like, oh, I'm sorry. Like, he was messaging me and saying, oh, I'm sorry she woke again. Like, I'll take everyone out in the morning so you can have a sleep in and you can have a rest. And then I was like, just didn't reply, and he's like, are you okay? And I was like, just sent a photo of the mucus plug and didn't say anything. And he's like, oh, okay, so like things are happening, but like obviously you're not in labor yet, but like that's a good sign, right? Because I think I had spent so much time complaining about like pain through the end of my pregnancy that I had been like, oh, it's so painful, but I'm not in labor, don't worry. And like I've said that so many times to him that he was like, yeah, I know you're not in labor yet, like it's fine. But then I was like, no, I think I am. And he was like, oh my gosh, okay. Instantly he just jumped into that like home birth dad role of being like, I want to get everything out, let's get the pool sorted, all of the things. And I was like, no, calm down, it's fine, like I just want to rest, you go back to bed, let's just, chill out for a minute and we'll make sure that it really is happening. And I think in hindsight, he really probably should have jumped up and done all of the things. But I was like ingrained in the idea that I was going to have potentially a long labor because of my first. So yeah, I ended up getting my daughter back down and then went and laid in bed and was just breathing through the sensations as much as I possibly could until after only about an hour, I reckon, I was needing to vocalize and breathing was just not doing the trick anymore. So yeah, at that point I was like, okay, yep, let's get up. And I think that was the one part of having a home birth that was actually really stressful for us. We were so stressed getting everything set up in those early like stages of labor and just having to organize all of the moving things. So we had a birth photographer, we had my midwife, we had someone to come and pick up our dog. Ben needed to fill up the birth pool, and we also had someone coming over to be with my daughter. So yeah, it was just like a lot of organizing, and I feel like I was really lucid in that part of labor where I was like in between contractions, like calling out instructions for things for him to do. So yeah, once they started to get that little bit more intense and I was starting to feel that they were quite powerful, I felt a little bit of apprehension creep up, and instantly, as soon as this apprehension came up, I just heard this voice in my head that saying, this pain is power. And like that just settled me straight back down. And it was crazy because I had been practicing affirmations and meditations through my whole pregnancy, and that was not one that I had ever thought or had ever come to me before. But right in that moment, it was exactly what I needed to hear, and it really let me have that, like, I don't know that it was necessarily fear of the pain, but just that little bit of like pull back from it. It's exactly what I needed to like let it go. And I felt myself really intentionally soften down into that intensity. And I was quite surprised by how intense it was so quickly in comparison. I did not have like a slow lead up like I had previously. It was quite hard and fast pretty much from like the first hour. So I really had to make a conscious effort at trying to like soften and let the wave wash over me versus like engaging with it. And that was something that I had done a lot of work around in my pregnancy, knowing that I spent my first birth doing labor. This time I really wanted to be in it and just let my body unfold, and I was just a passenger in it, allowing it to happen. So yeah, I felt an overwhelming sense every time a contraction came on to ground myself. I didn't switch positions around, flip-flopping all over the shop like I did the first time. This time, every time a sensation came, I immediately flipped onto my hands and knees, and then in between I would like go onto my side, kind of in like a side lying release position in my little like nest that I had set up on the bed. And then yeah, every time a contraction came, I didn't have to think about it. I didn't think, oh, hands and knees is a good position. My body just grounded itself, which I think was really beautiful. But yeah, so pretty quickly we called our photographer to come, and I was also quite conscious of, I really wanted my daughter to be involved in the birth, but I wasn't sure how it would go. I think I knew that she would be okay, but I really wanted to have a contingency plan in place. So we had a really close friend that she knew really well who was going to be present as her support person, just in case. And so I felt a little bit of stress in my labor, worrying about if she would wake. And as soon as our friend arrived, I felt myself like let that go away immediately. I knew that she was taken care of and she was fine. And so having her in the house ended up being totally fine. And at one point, I remember hearing her cry to wake up in the morning. But as soon as I heard her stop, immediately I was just like, yeah, she's fine. She's taken care of. It's all good. And so, yeah, that ended up working out so perfectly. Yeah. And so then our midwife arrived and our photographer arrived within about 15 minutes of each other. And they just so respectfully and gently entered the birth space and just let us completely hands off, let us continue on how we were going. I started vocalizing very intensely through all of the sensations, and I think that was the main thing that I really lent on in my toolbox for labor is, yeah, my voice is definitely what I lean on the most. And at one point I ended up starting to feel kind of like a sensation in my vagina and was like, oh, I feel like I might want to do a wee. So we got up and went to the toilet, and instantly I was like, oh, that's way too much pressure. I cannot sit on the toilet. And at that point I was starting to get a little bit like uncomfortable with allowing things to flow. I wanted to change up where I was. So my husband suggested the shower. But what I had been conscious of was that the birth pool was a bit of a tricky thing to get filled. So we had our attachment tested about 3 times for the hose on our sink. My husband could not get it to work at all. So what had ended up happening was my friend who was here to be a support person for my daughter had ended up filling up the birth pool with buckets. So she had spent the whole time whilst my daughter was still asleep, luckily, just like coming back and forth and filling the birth pool up. So I was kind of in the back of my mind like, oh my gosh, am I going to actually be able to use the pool or not? I don't know where it's at. So he also knew that was unfolding at one point too. So he suggested the shower, but I didn't feel right in the shower. It wasn't the right place for where I needed to be. So I think actually I got on all fours on the shower, and through one of a particularly intense contraction just started saying I was pushing. And I feel like that was one of the moments where I really looked to my midwife for some reassurance. And yeah, like, I don't know, it's one of those things where I don't feel like I needed that external validation to start pushing, but I did find it really helpful in the moment of maybe there was a sense of worry about like, oh gosh, this is happening really fast. I was not expecting it to happen as quickly as this is. And I just needed to vocalize that I was pushing so everyone was aware of where I was at. And as soon as I said that, she didn't say anything, but I heard her quietly say to my husband, who was doing hip squeezes, which he had been doing through the whole labor, "Are you okay to catch baby here?" And he was like, "Yeah." And as soon as I heard them have that little exchange, I just felt this wave of like, they know I'm about to birth my baby. Like, I know I'm about to birth my baby, but everyone else like agrees almost. It gave me that sense of just like, this is really happening. And I was able to just go with the intensity from that moment. So I then said I wanted to hop in the pool, not knowing if it was full, where it was at, or whatever. I was just like, nah, if I'm about to birth my baby, I'm not doing it in the shower. Let's get to the pool. So that was the first moment where I really acknowledged where everyone was at in the room. And I saw we were in our bedroom, and the pool was set up in the corner of our room. So it was quite a limited space moving from our ensuite into our pool. And I was aware of all of the people who were there. And I just felt like this need to close my eyes, hop into the pool, and turn my back to everyone. And as soon as I did that, I was like, oh, okay, I feel safe again. I can feel the energy of everyone in the room, but I'm not seeing them and it's not interrupting my flow. And there's just something so special and sacred to be said about that moment of when I like was sinking down into the birth pool, and I like felt the softness of the pool underneath my knees and the warm water, which ironically was even far hotter than it was in the hospital path when I had like been complaining about that. But my friend had been using full-blown hot water in the buckets to fill it up, thinking that we'd do it at hot water so that it had time to cool down by the time I eventually got there, not knowing that I was going to birth within like an hour. So it was really, really hot. And for a second I was like, oh gosh, it's hot. And I think the second midwife, who had arrived a couple of minutes prior, went and got some cold water, swished it around behind me, and then I was fine again. And it's funny, I reflect back on how quick and intense that labor felt, but I never once held any fear around if I could do that, if I could do it. There was always a sense of I know I am doing this. I know it's happening. I just don't want to right now. Like, why another contraction right now? But it was never a sense of I couldn't. And I think I love that so much when I think back about it, of like, whilst it was so incredibly intense and just so powerful and like otherworldly, I never questioned if I could do it or not. And yeah, I really love that. So yeah, when I sunk down into the pool, I had previously started to feel slightly out of control with my voice, and I was definitely doing far more screams than like roars. And so I was really trying to bring my sound back down. But as soon as I hopped into the pool, it was crazy because the intensity just lifted again, but I went quiet, and the like peace that like washed over me in those moments was just, yeah, really, really crazy to think about. And I think it was definitely that rest and be thankful stage unfolding. And I look back at my film and it's so warm and beautiful and soft in those moments. But I remember how I felt, and I felt, yeah, it was so much intensity inside of me, but I didn't need to express it in that outward way anymore. So yeah, as it turns out, it was only about like 6 minutes after hopping into the pool before he was born. And I think I was quiet on those like first few contractions of him like moving down, and then I definitely had the most powerful scream slash roars as his head crowned. And yeah, again, I remember vividly that feeling of his shoulders rotating in between the contractions, and then him like flying out. He kind of like powerfully flew out behind rather than gracefully swam off like my daughter did. And I was on all fours with my like hands up against the pool, and I was gripping onto my birth comb, and my husband was like holding underneath my armpits. And because he couldn't quite see, he didn't know that like he was imminently about to come out. So he was so shocked, like when I stood up and actually had like baby in between my legs. So that was really special for him. He said he was like so taken aback by being like, oh my God, it's already done and over. What? So yeah, that moment of him flying out, my midwife just tapped him slightly to push him through in between my legs. And then the moment of like hopping up onto my knees feels like such a blur. Like I don't remember going from being on all fours to suddenly being upright, but I vividly remember the moment that I looked down into the water and like could see his blurry little face and umbilical cord underneath, like floating underneath the water. And I remember in that exact moment making a really conscious decision to be really gentle. And I just wanted to do that slowly and gently. I didn't want to like reef him up out of the water and put him to my chest. I just wanted to like intentionally do it. And I look back at my film and I still did do it quite fast. But I remember in the moment being like, okay, take this in. This is really sacred. Do it slowly. And I get goosebumps thinking about it because that's not something that I had thought about at all in my pregnancy. I hadn't planned to do that. It was just this wave that came over me in the moment. And yeah, I will never forget that moment of looking down in the water and seeing like the purple little umbilical cord and then just lifting him up. And I brought him up to my chest and leaned straight back onto the birth pool and just let out the most palatable sigh I think I've ever heard. I look back at my film and like, I get goosebumps even thinking and hearing like that noise again, because the relief was just huge. I was so, oh my God, it was that moment of like, you know, the analogy when you go to the stars to collect your baby and bring them back down to earth. And it was that moment of me landing back in my body where we'd just been in this other world together. And I needed that second to just like come back down into my body. And then as soon as I gave myself that space and time and everyone else was just quiet and just witnessed it and let it unfold for me, then I could switch my focus into like my baby. And I love so much how those moments were treated with such tenderness, and like it was so sacred. No one did anything. No one touched me. It was all me. And we had the most beautiful moments letting my baby land in his body and watching him transition. And I was so aware of that it can take a minute for them to come to their body, and you just need to allow that to happen. And yeah, so I spoke to him and I was rubbing him, and I think it ended up only being like 30 seconds or so, but I then took him away from my chest, and just as I went to go and lift him up to reposition him, he let out a cry, And I just, yeah, that moment just feels like pure magic. Like there's not even words to really describe it. In that exact moment that he let out the cry, my daughter came running into the room. So we had initially planned, or I had envisioned her being present to witness him be born, but no one had gone out and grabbed her. So she had been awake for about half an hour. So she had slept through majority of my labor and then woke up within half an hour, and she had popped in and out of the room a few times, but I hadn't noticed that she was there. So she was just happy as she understood that baby was coming, and like was listening to me be very vocal, but never showed any signs of being like reluctant or whatever. She just got it. And I love that so much. And yeah, I think we don't give kids enough recognition for how like in tune with birth and like intuitive little wise beings they actually are.
Totally.
Yes, she just got it. And we had done so much prep in my pregnancy. She had seen every birth video under the sun, and we had read all of the birth books and everything. So she, yeah, I think she had a little bit of an understanding of what was actually happening, even though she was only 22 months old. But yeah, as it turns out, I thought I had wanted her there, but I think it's even more beautiful that she was just in the next room and heard his cry, jumped down off the couch herself and said baby, and came running into the room herself and was so excited. And she's a really like sensitive soul, and she just had this like excitement but like quietly curious anticipation energy over her. And I was so relieved to have my baby boy in my arms, but the moment that I saw her walk into the room and witness him for the first time, that is when I got my love rush. I guess I hadn't yet developed that relationship with my son yet, but having like such a deep connection with my daughter, seeing her in that birth space and watching and seeing her witness everything was just, yeah, the most magical thing ever. And it is to my date my favorite part of my birth, having her involved in that way. She came straight over and was like so gentle and like wanting to touch him, and then she hopped straight in the pool with me and was like gently patting him and talking. And yeah, I just that was definitely my favorite part of the whole experience.
Oh, my heart is exploding. Oh, so then how did the birth of your placenta unfold?
Yeah, so we stayed in the pool for a little while, just like taking him in and watching my daughter get to know her little brother. And there was no rush to hop out of the pool. No one said anything. I think it must have been only a few short minutes after I started feeling a little bit crampy again, and I started feeling myself need to pause and breathe through the sensations. And I think I mentioned that to my midwife, and she was like, oh, that could be a placenta being ready. Would you like to hop up and we can see if it's ready to come? So I was supported in getting up and out of the pool, and then squatted over a bowl to the side of the pool and gave a little push, and the placenta popped straight out, no worries at all. So yeah, it was just a non-event. It just happened. And yeah, I was really, really pleased with how that ended up unfolding.
Yeah, especially after your first experience. And did you do anything special with either of your placentas? I don't think I asked you that before.
Yeah, sorry, I should have mentioned with the first, that was something that I do hold a little bit of regret around. I didn't, and I had the thought that I wanted to keep it and I wanted to plant it under a tree. And the reason that I didn't was because I didn't want to be difficult, and I was embarrassed about what they would think if I had asked to do something like that, because it seemed too like alternative or hippie or woo-woo just because of my internalized belief. And I feel really sad that that's how I felt in that time. And it's such a shame that that's how that ended up happening for me. So no, I didn't with my first, but I have with my second. And I think it's been really healing to have my daughter be so a part of this whole experience. And I think it's almost, yeah, like symbolic for her as well, with, yeah, being able to like kind of complete the circle for him, for my son, and have her along for that journey. So yeah, we've got it at the moment just in the freezer, but my plan is to do some sort of like ritual or ceremony with planting it on his first birthday.
I love that.
Yeah, so that's the plan. I'm not sure exactly how that's going to look, but I definitely, yeah, want to be able to like take some time to honor that in a special way.
Oh, beautiful. Well, we do need to wrap things up. There's so many questions that I want to ask because this is such and I've loved our conversation. Obviously, postpartum is really important. So do you want to, in a brief way, reflect on your postpartum experience the second time around, especially in comparison to your first.
Yeah, I think I will just say that this postpartum was just so, so beautiful, and life was very different. So it really allowed us the space to create a really special postpartum. We had like a plan of the 5-5-5 rule, and I think just always being able to come back to that really allowed me to honor my body and rest in the way that it needed to. And there was just so much softness and slowness that I think like postpartum really calls us into. And I wasn't sure how that would look with a toddler, but do you know what? She is so intuitive that she really embraced that softness and slowness with us. And like, of course she was a chaotic toddler at moments, but I really saw a change in her behavior of just, yeah, being in that phase with us. And I think it made for such a beautiful adjustment into, yeah, like a family of 4 and mothering 2 babies. So yeah, it was really beautiful. And I did end up having a couple of really small tears, and they weren't stitched. And I cannot believe how different it felt. Like it was just, it barely even hurt at all. They healed beautifully. There was just, yeah, no issues about that at all. And having thought I had experienced the pinnacle of how birth could be the first time round, to now having experienced this, I'm like, no, this is how it's supposed to be. This is what nature intends it to be. When you allow like the hormones to flow, it just, yeah, it really sets you up for the most beautiful entry into mothering.
Totally. Our bodies are amazing. So to wrap things up, do you have any advice for mothers out there, expecting mothers who, I guess, even reflecting on your entire journey? So conception, pregnancy, birth, and postpartum, what advice can you offer?
Oh, I feel like there's so much that could be said about this, but something that really seems to be coming to mind a lot for me lately is just the idea that you don't need to settle for your birth. I feel like so many of us have come from that good girl culture where we don't want to be a nuisance. But I feel like it's really important to invite women that like your birth experiences deserve to be held with so much like love and reverence. And it's so important. And just because that's what the norm is, or that's what everyone around you does, doesn't mean that that's what you need to settle for. And I think there's so much magic and like beautiful learnings and like expansion and growth and like just love that can come from allowing yourself to consider that there are other paths on this journey, and knowing that you are so worthy of that and you deserve that. Yeah, I hope that so many women can really see that it doesn't have to be about you, catering to other people's wishes on such an important rite of passage in our lives, and really understand and know that it can be magical and you deserve it to be magical. I think that's the main thing.
Oh, I love that advice. Well, thank you so much, Laura, for coming on the Mama Village podcast. I have absolutely loved your story, and I could probably go for another hour or two if I'm completely honest.
Yeah, me too. Look, you started me talking about birth and I just can't stop.
I had to make a real effort to try and just to listen that time, because I just love so many elements of your story. Well, again, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you for having the space for me to share. It's so important.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Mama Village podcast. Check out the show notes for a link to the Mama Village Instagram page, where I upload pregnancy, birth, postpartum, and motherhood resources. Please let me know what you think of today's show and what you would like to hear from the podcast by leaving a rating and review. If you like the show, please subscribe and leave a review on your podcast platform. If you would like to share your positive pregnancy, birth, postpartum, and motherhood story, or if you have education in the space to share, please send me a direct message on Instagram or email the.mamavillage@outlook.com. For all my listeners out there, thank you for your continuing support, and I will speak to you all in next week's episode.